This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The pandemic, the economy and politics. A look at Tunisia's current crisis. The UN Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs gives an update on his visit to Ethiopia's Tigray region. And the UK opens up to EU and US travellers, but tough rules remain against France. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour, US President Joe Biden's ban on American investment in some Chinese firms takes effect. And in sport, Kenya expecting its first medals in the women's 5,000 meters and the men's 3,000 meter steeplechase. In our top story this hour, we start in Ethiopia, where the visiting UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, has been on a two-day visit to the conflict-hit region of Tigray. Now, the conflict in the region triggered a humanitarian crisis, and that's led to international calls for intervention. Meanwhile, the country's national carrier, Ethiopian Airlines, has denied reports that it transported government arms to Tigray. Let's get to the very latest now. We're joined by CGTN's Girum Chala, live for us in Addis Ababa. Of course, Girum, the international community and the UN itself has been commenting on the situation in Tigray since November last year. But what is the latest now from the UN following this official visit to Tigray?
So, Lindy, as you've said, Martin Griffiths, UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs coordinator, has been in Ethiopia, according to reports that we're hearing from the UN headquarters here in Addis Ababa. He is here in order to find a way of getting access to humanitarian services to the Tigray region state. As you might remember, the United Nations has been complaining that it is going to face humanitarian catastrophe in the coming few days as supplies are dwindling every single day, and trucks, more than 100 of them, are stuck in border areas between Afar and the Tigray regional state. So Martin Griffiths has engaged several organizations under the government here, and also UN other sector organizations like the UN OCHA, so that he can help facilitate the already sticking problems that are in the hands of the humanitarian services deliverers. So we are expecting, and according to him as well, is that the government and the stakeholders in the Tigray regional state, including TPLF, are going to facilitate ways so that humanitarian services can be delivered to the Tigray regional state and problems can be solved. But he has explained to all stakeholders that things are getting out of control and humanitarian catastrophe can be a reality in the next few days if things are not solved.
Well, we have seen that the Ethiopian government has been quick to acknowledge the humanitarian challenges in the Tigray region, but also continued to defend their actions there. Just tell us now how the government is reacting to this visit by the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs.
Well, the Ethiopian government time and again said it is willing and is still working with aid agencies, including those which belong to the UN. And Martin Griffiths he has been also briefed by officials here. They have told him that more than 500,000 quintals of fertilizers have been delivered for the Tigray region state before the army left Mekelle city, and also 400,000 plus quintals of wheat were also left there, including millions of liters of fuel for aid agencies to operate in that regional state. The government wants also Mr. Martin Griffiths to understand that it is the TPLF which is hampering access to that regional state so that aid can be delivered. But All in all, Lindy, you have to understand that these UN aid agencies are in some sort of limbo. They are being challenged because they don't know who to engage at this moment in time, especially from the Tigray regional state side, as there is no communication to establish any sort of facilitation for humanitarian access. So the government is committed. We have also been talking to officials this morning that they're saying that they are ready time and again to help with to assist the aid agencies, including UN, so that this humanitarian catastrophe can be avoided at any time. So we have to wait and see, perhaps after his visit, if things are going to change for better.
Indeed, and that is certainly what we hope. Thank you so much, Girum Chala, joining us there live from Addis Ababa. Let's turn to news now from Botswana. The country has deployed 296 troops to Mozambique to fight an insurgency in the Cabo Delgado province. Countries of the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, are sending troops for the first time to quell the growing insurgency. Botswana becomes the second SADC nation to send troops after South Africa. Meanwhile, Rwanda, which is not part of the regional 16-member bloc, sent 1,000 troops earlier this month. Well, let's bring you more on this now. We go to Mozambique for a clearer picture of what all this means for the country. We're joined via Zoom by Professor Adriano Novunga, the director of the Center for Democracy and Development. Professor, thank you so much for your time. To begin with, just help us understand the scale of the insurgency that is currently taking place in Cabo Delgado, just in terms of violence and displacement. What are these troops from SADC preparing to face?
Thank you very much. The violent extremism in northern Mozambique is a major problem. It is creating unprecedented level of havoc in Cabo Delgado, with humanitarian crisis, with about 800 IDPs which are poorly assisted, and from the military aspect, from the last attack to the Palma town, it seems that violent extremist organization, it has been growing in capacity and also in coordination capacity as well. So we expect that the SADC and Rwandan forces coming to support Mozambique, they will have hard work to get the region militarily stabilized.
And Professor, I mean, as you've mentioned, it's troops from SADC as well as Rwanda. What does this regional military intervention actually mean for Mozambique and the people of the country, but of course as well as the government itself in working with regional partners?
It's a mix of excitement and concern. Excitement because for the first time people see that neighboring countries, including the Rwandese, are coming to support Mozambique to fight the violent extremist organization, which is sitting in the well-declared gas reserve in that area, which is a unique opportunity for Mozambique to develop the nation and the region. But it means militarization of Cabo Delgado. And militarization might not necessarily be the solution for northern Cabo Delgado. Looking at the root causes of the problem, which speak to governance failure, which speak to extractivism without development, marginalization, and disenfranchisement of the population, including the young people, we thought that military intervention should be in the region to allow larger scale humanitarian assistance, including returning of IDPs to their areas, but more importantly, governance fixed, set right to address the root causes of the problem. So it's a mix of excitement and concern, also including the issue of human rights, because if you look at the different nations, there are different military cultures and different operating codes. That might also mean that coordination is going to be a challenge. And Mozambique, as it does not have the capacity to deal with the situation, it will also have challenges in coordinating different nations, and that might also mean competition from these countries.
Professor, thank you so much for that analysis. Joining us there via Zoom from Maputo, Professor Adriano Novunga. Let's turn now to news from Tunisia. A sharp increase in the number of COVID-19 cases, coupled with years of government neglect to maintain a health system, has stoked public anger. For more on this, here's CGTN's Joy Kirukijuma.
Hatem Hawawi's 71-year-old aunt, Mehreza, recently died of COVID-19 in Tunisia. His family is still mourning the loss.
In every household, we have a funeral, and we have pain and wounds. And this is our problem now. If we're going to talk about resources, this is a cumulative problem. We can't hold just one or two people responsible. Our government didn't work on this issue because the government did not value the citizen.
Hawawi's hardship is mirrored most acutely in poorer regions like Jendouba in Tunisia's northwest. Years of misgovernance have undermined a public health sector that was once a point of national pride.
All the parties lied to us. They promised us everything.
Weeks leading up to President Kais Saied's decision to sack Prime Minister Hichem Mechichi and suspend Parliament, Tunisians poured onto the streets in protest at the government. President Saied soon afterwards announced that the military would take over the handling of the pandemic. Deploying the army appears popular in Jendouba.
The government could have given responsibility to the army from the beginning. They are capable of everything. Our healthcare services are limited and people want to get vaccinated.
The Ministry of National Defense is contributing. Regarding public health, we do not have military health or public health. There is only one healthcare system in the country, and therefore the Ministry of Defense is a strong partner in this field.
So far, around 963,000 people have been fully vaccinated among a population of 11.6 million. Tunisia has reported over 20,000 deaths and more than 500,000 infections. At one point last month, it had the worst infection rate in Africa. Joy Kirukijuma, CGTN.
People who have been fully vaccinated in the US or European Union no longer have to isolate when arriving in the UK from an amber list country. The rule change came into effect across the UK this morning at 4 a.m. local time. The UK government has said the change, which was announced last week, will help reunite families and friends whose loved ones live abroad. Let's get you more details on this. We're now joined live from London by CGTN correspondent Naveed Jabakal. Naveed, tell us more about this opening up for travellers from the EU and the US. I imagine this has been welcome news for the tourism sector and airline companies.
Yeah, that's right. And millions of people who will now be able to come to the UK without the need to quarantine. As you say already, people arriving since 4 a.m. local time here on Monday, the 2nd of August. Travellers from the EU and the United States who've been double vaccinated no longer need to quarantine. The previous rule meant they would have to self-isolate for up to 10 days. Now, it's not quite business as usual. If they have been double vaccinated, they're allowed in or under the age of 18. But there's also testing to be carried out, either a lateral flow test or a PCR test before departure, and then another one on the second day after arrival. So still the sort of testing and and other restrictions in place. But this is a welcome move. People who've arrived already at London's Heathrow Airport saying that it was a welcome relief to see family and friends. That's one factor that's driven this, the need to see family and friends and travel across borders. But the other wider picture here has been economic as well. The closure of these flights and these routes for many, many months now, more than a year in some cases, has really battered the airline industry, battered the aviation industry in the UK in particular. Heathrow Airport, for example, once one of the busiest in the world, still among the busiest in the world, it said before the pandemic, it said that in June passenger figures were less than 1 million people passing through. That's down about 90% on normal pre-pandemic levels. It's also said the closure of that transatlantic route between the US and the UK was costing the UK economy $32 million every single day. And there's that economic argument as well that's really driven this decision, particularly from the ruling Conservative Party here. Lots of figures saying that travel needs to be opened up, otherwise the UK will be left behind, especially with its high vaccination rates. They say, what's the point if we can't open up things and get things moving again? But that's been another key factor. But still, people, there is an element of caution here. The government taking a cautious approach and says it will review its next list of countries allowed in, because although the aviation industry has welcomed this, there are lots of people who say much more needs to be done. 62 million jobs lost last year in the industry worldwide, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. So although the industry has welcomed this, it says much more needs to be done and more routes need to be opened up much quicker.
So one of those routes that has not fully opened up, of course, is France. Those travelling from France will still have to isolate if they come to the UK. Tell us more about what's behind this decision, Naveed, and the reaction from both France and the EU.
Yeah, the reaction from France, as you can imagine, hasn't been too positive. It was actually somewhat of a diplomatic spat, possibly even a row last week between ministers in the UK and France. The countries around the rest of the European Union allowed to come in from today, except for France. And I think that's been a bitter pill to swallow, because according to the French government, vaccination rates there are pretty high and case numbers are pretty low. What's made matters worse and led to that diplomatic disagreement, if you like, is mixed messaging from the UK government. On Thursday last week, Dominic Raab, the UK Foreign Secretary, said that it was actually cases in Reunion Island, a small overseas territory of France, which contributed to the decision. The next day, the UK's Transport Minister, who heads the department responsible for travel, said that actually it was on mainland France, the cases, beta variant cases there, concerns around that have driven this decision. So a bit of mixed messaging hasn't helped the picture, but as far as the UK government's concerned, it's taking a cautious approach, particularly because of what's happened earlier this year with the Delta variant first identified in India. There was a lot of criticism that it didn't close borders enough. Perhaps it's trying to avoid getting into that situation again. But as things stand at the moment, the next review from the UK government is either, we're possibly thinking Wednesday or Thursday this week. France expected to move off that Amber Plus list, as it's called. But until then, the current rules remain the same. If you come here from France, you have to self-isolate for up to 10 days. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Naveed Jabakal, joining us there live from London. You are watching Africa Live. Time now for a short break. Coming up, we take a deeper look at the traditional beliefs, stigma and treatment of mental illness in Africa.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Afghanistan's president is blaming U.S. troop withdrawal for the country's worsening security situation. Ashraf Ghani told Parliament on Monday that Washington's decision was abrupt, leading to the rise in violence. Fighting between Afghan forces and the Taliban has intensified in recent weeks as insurgents continue to seize more territory. Overnight, at least 3 civilians were killed in Kandahar amid heavy fighting. Clashes have also been reported near the southern border with Pakistan. Meanwhile, Russia and Uzbekistan have begun military exercises near the Afghan border over fears the violence could spill over into Central Asia. The United States has nearly completed its withdrawal, pulling out 3,000 troops by the end of this month after 20 years of war. The U.S. says it will continue supporting the Afghan government, including with financial aid and airstrikes. There is growing recognition of the prevalence of mental illnesses in Africa. However, the range of medical services available remains alarmingly low, and mental disorders are still stigmatized. In some communities, a tension exists between the traditional, the spiritual, and the medical in the treatment of mental illnesses. I traveled to Kisumu to explore this issue further for this episode of Panorama Africa. Please note the story contains images that some viewers may find disturbing.
A port city on the shores of Lake Victoria, Kisumu is the largest city in western Kenya. Its social, political and economic significance has made it a key player in Kenya's pre- and post-independent history. It's also home to Father John Pesa, founder of the Holy Ghost Coptic Church of Africa and a self-proclaimed healer of the mentally ill.
Father John Pesa's Sunday service is well underway for a congregation of the faithful and his patients. It is a smaller crowd than usual due to pandemic regulations, he tells us. Even so, it is clear the cleric enjoys a loyal and abiding following.
How many people love me?
Father Pesa's reputation precedes him. He's been healing the sick since 1961, he claims, but no stranger to controversy. Father Pesa's methods and practice, including chaining his patients, have earned him fierce criticism.
Imagine you are alone dealing with 5 unstable people. What would you do? And yet some have the wandering disease, where they just move around aimlessly. If you leave that person, they might just wander off. What if a person gets hit by a car? What will you tell the family that put this patient under your care? So we chain them.
Unexpectedly, Pesa conducts a seemingly staged demonstration of how his healing works.
He is going into a trance. His mind is resting. I'm the one who produces his spiritual power. It's the power that is doing this. That is the power of God that heals people at Coptic Church. God is the only one who knows what he does and how it heals. It is a natural factor beyond my human knowledge. Even I don't know.
Natural factor beyond human knowledge.
Whenever I touch someone and they fall into a trance, gradually they begin to change. That change is what shows me the person is healed.
A short drive from Pesa's church brings us to Maseno University, where we meet Professor Otieno Omolo. The retired physician turned lecturer was among Kenya's first cohort of child psychiatrists and once led the country's only psychiatric hospital. His disregard for Father Pesa is evident.
That is somebody who is completely ignorant of whatever he's doing. And most of the things you are talking about, I'm aware of them. People being chained and all, those are criminal activities. And it is unfortunate that the judicial arm or the executive arm is not taking action against that.
The judicial arm has tried. Last year, a court ordered PESA to pay damages of up to $5,000 for violating a young man's freedom of movement and right to education. But the courts can do little when patients are voluntarily placed in the cleric's care by their own relatives. A former patient's unshakable trust in Father PESA and his methods is evidence of that.
Yes, at one time when I was like somehow becoming violent, then I was also chained. Yes, but that is just to control those who may be violent. You see, some of these illnesses, they may not be treated fully in our hospitals or medically. So that's why prayers are also important. And faith healing is very real, and it works.
In many cases, faith healers operate in a grey area, not formally regulated either by the church or government, and this is where abuses can take place. In 2020, a Human Rights Watch report revealed how men, women and children with psychosocial disabilities are chained or locked in confined spaces in 60 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East and the Americas. Professor Omolo suggests the formalization of spiritual counseling would help eliminate abuses. After all, spirituality can contribute to an individual's healing.
Now, as a scientist, as a medic, of course, I don't think prayers would help anybody as such directly. However, I'm very much aware of spirituality. I'm very much aware of the fact that when you are talking of quality of life, which of course is both physical and mental, isn't it? The issue of the spiritual domain is important. People who have strong faith or who believe in something generally tend to have a better outcome than somebody who just has no belief in anything. Because it gives us, most times spirituality gives us some sort of a direction.
The influence of the spiritual domain gives legitimacy to alternative healing practices, especially on a continent where clinical mental health services are scarce. In Africa, the number of psychiatrists per 100,000 people ranges from 0.01 in Burundi, 0.2 here in Kenya, and 2.4 in Mauritius. But this is a far cry from high-income countries with an average of 9 psychiatrists per 100,000 people. The leading causes of mental illness in Africa include poverty, war and conflict, insufficient resources, and living with other diseases such as HIV/AIDS or cancer. The coronavirus pandemic has raised levels of stress and trauma globally, making the situation even more dire. A 2016 UN report identified depression, anxiety, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder as the most common mental illnesses in Africa. But often, lack of awareness renders these disorders invisible until sufferers display severe and dramatic symptoms. To make matters worse, Africa has insufficient outpatient facilities and hospital beds for patients with mental illnesses. This means that the proportion of Africans who go untreated ranges from 75% in South Africa to 90% in Ethiopia and Nigeria. This is known as the treatment gap. In South Africa, the treatment gap is sometimes filled by traditional healers known as sangomas, who diagnose and heal through divination, herbal medicine and rituals. The ability to heal is considered a gift or a calling bestowed by one's ancestors that must then be honed and developed through guided training. Sangomas claim to treat physical, spiritual and mental disorders.
We give them some things to smoke and medicines to drink, but it depends on what's disturbing them. Sometimes it's because they have a spiritual calling, or they're dealing with bad spirits.
Where traditional treatments might not work, Gogo Shabalala refers her patients to medical doctors.
We work together with doctors. We respect each other's gifts. You have gifts and I have mine.
Unethical healers have been known to take advantage of people's beliefs.
Some people use a gift for the wrong things. They go to school to become a traditional healer, but don't actually stay the course. They don't finish. Ultimately, a Sangoma is a healer, not a killer.
There is a shift emerging in the policy response to mental health in parts of Africa. In 2020, Kenya became the first country on the continent to appoint a task force and a presidential advisor on mental health. This signaled a growing awareness of the scale of mental health problems.
In 2019, the government recognized the need to really look at mental health in its totality in our country against the background of the fact that depression was going up, domestic violence was going up, suicides were going up, alcohol use disorders were going up. And our task force was asked to establish why. The task force went right through the country, talked to all manner of people in the private sector, in religion, armed forces, the government itself, and reported in July of last year that in fact we have a huge problem with mental health in our country against a very small investment of finance and of human resources.
Dr. Njenga is also the chairperson of a chain of private mental health hospitals in Nairobi. For those who can afford it, the facilities treat psychiatric disorders in a safe and secure environment. The hospital's emphasis on dignity is reflected in the design, clinical approach, and relationship with patients, all in an effort to produce the best outcomes and fight the stigma associated with mental illness.
The reason people stigmatized mental health before is because they were hopeless and helpless, and they felt that there's nothing we could do to help them. Now, as the dark night is coming to an end, people are realizing that actually the earlier you get care, the more likely that you get a good outcome out of it. And that, for me, is what will hit the biggest blow against stigma: knowledge, information, and good outcomes.
Awareness and destigmatization is also being driven by a new generation of mental health advocates, such as broadcast journalist Eugene Mweri.
I went into mental health as a whole because of my own personal story. So early in 2017, I was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety. Unfortunately, that came after my first suicide attempt. Let me remind you that in Kenya, here we are, suicide is a criminal offense under the Constitution, which means you can get arrested for trying to take your own life. You can end up in a cell. Knowing that, I still went public with my own story. Nobody deserves to be at the point where they feel that you are so alone. I mean, you're deserving of nothing, that there's nothing left to tether you to this world. Nobody deserves to get to that point at all.
Through advocacy and establishing an emergency support network, Mweri is changing the narrative around mental health and connecting those in crisis with professionals. It's work he does not take lightly.
The generations that are coming are more emotionally aware, more in touch with their emotions than the generations before. So the idea of talking things out needs to be encouraged now more than ever.
More needs to be done for mental health in Africa, but there is hope.
As a person who lives with a mental health condition and psychosocial disability,
young people across the continent are bringing the conversation on mental wellness to the fore.
Learn about mental health, share with your friends so we can have...
Alongside the work of experts, ethical healers and medical practitioners, mental health policy and practice may well change for the better. Lindy Mtongana, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Coming up in business, US President Joe Biden's ban on American investment in some Chinese firms takes effect. And businesses in East Africa grapple with increased costs as data charges rise.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
An executive order from U.S. President Joe Biden takes effect Monday to ban American investments in 59 Chinese firms. Beijing has criticized the move and threatened countermeasures. CGTN's Zhao Yunfei reports.
Biden has expanded a Trump-era order to restrict Chinese companies. It bans Americans from trading securities of dozens of Chinese companies with alleged links to the Chinese military. The blacklist was first signed by President Trump last November. China Telecom and China Mobile were among the 31 firms. In June, President Biden added 28 companies to the list, which now has a total of 59 companies. It takes effect on August 2nd. Biden's executive order cites security concerns, while Beijing calls it an abuse of the concept of national security.
China urges the United States to respect market laws and principles, cancel these so-called lists that suppress Chinese companies, and provide Chinese companies with a fair, just and non-discriminatory business and investment environment. China will take necessary measures to resolutely safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises.
An expert says the move is an attempt by the U.S. to decouple from China.
This is actually a political situation in that country, and they would like to find some enemy or adversary for their own sake, for some specific groups of interests to take China as the threat. It's not good for the relationship between the two countries, and of course it's not good for the public in the two countries.
Professor Tang says high-tech companies in both countries will be affected, but the U.S. cannot restrict China's progress in technological innovation.
The development of high-tech and science is a natural development for any country, for any individual. At this moment, the United States can not stop the cooperation, stop the development.
Professor Tang says while the Biden administration has continued his predecessor's aggressive approach against China, it is unlikely China will make any compromises in the area of technology. He says the two sides should seek a new model for future cooperation. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Beijing.
Businesses in East Africa are beginning to grapple with high costs of operations. That's as authorities begin to enforce new excise duty rates in their 2021-22 budgets. The cost of airtime and internet data has risen by more than 10% as governments seek additional financing to fund their burgeoning budgets. CG10's Nick Mudimba reports on the situation in Kenya.
High cost of doing business in East Africa region is now becoming the norm after an increase in digital charges such as cost of airtime, mobile money transactions, calls and texts. In Kenya, the government increased excess duty on airtime and telephone services from 15% to 20%, while in Uganda, authorities increased the excess duty on airtime as well as internet data to 12%. And it's not different in Tanzania as the government introduced a 17% excise on airtime. Though the tariffs are getting heavier, most telecommunications companies are still enjoying consistent subscription bases, even as the taxman casts his net wider.
I think revenue authorities in the region have been trying to harmonize and coalesce around standardization of rates and to make sure that taxation across the region is harmonized and to deal with issues with fiscal justice and fiscal inequalities in tax regime. So the EAC has these programs where they're trying to get revenue authorities to talk. Those commissioner generals of revenue authorities have been meeting to agree on these things. But there are also programs. I think at the continental level, there is the Africa Tax Administration Forum that's been working with revenue authorities across the region on how to make the regimes better.
Kenya's leading telecom provider Safaricom has a net worth of $10 billion and market capitalization of $598 million, which is the largest in East Africa. The Vodafone-owned telco has a base of 35.6 million subscribers, equivalent to 64.5% market share. Airtel Kenya Limited, a subsidiary of Airtel Africa, is the second largest telecommunication services provider in Kenya. It has an estimated 16.2 million subscribers of the total 59.8 million subscribers in the Kenyan market, equivalent to 27.2% market share. Airtel's market share has been rising steadily over the last few years. MTN Uganda is the largest telecom company in Uganda, with 14.2 million subscribers, accounting for 55% market share. But the rise in the charges hasn't been met well with some subscribers.
I think there are two issues. One, many economies in the region were already, in a slow growth trajectory. Revenue authorities were already experiencing, they were not beating targets, so there were already revenue deficits. So many countries were actually going that direction to see new areas or to broaden the tax base, to see where they could find areas that they can tax, and therefore this area of the digital economy was already coming up, and people were learning from other areas, other regions of the world.
The new digital tax will now trickle down to the common citizen. That means they'll have to dig deeper in their pockets to service their digital lifestyles and operations. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, let's go to Tanzania now to have a look at how individuals and businesses there are dealing with high costs of airtime and internet data. Here's CGTN's Isaac Lokando with more.
Joyce Mujaya depends on her phone to run her online retail clothing business. 2 years ago, she began posting clothes online to build a customer base with hopes of one day setting up a physical shop. However, the recently introduced mobile money levies are making it harder for her to do business.
Clients who want to pay via mobile money are reluctant to incur additional costs to pay for product because the money they're sending to me has already been slashed on their end due to the levy. So what happens is that I end up incurring losses.
The new levies are not limited to mobile money transactions. Excise duty on airtime in Tanzania stands at 17%. Mobile services such as calls, SMS and data are subject to an 18% value-added tax. The government says it is paying attention to growing public concern over the rising cost of communication.
I ask that the public remains calm in these matters. We will continue to offer explanations in all areas that require clarifications, and we will take steps in the areas that require action so that the building of our nation can continue.
So far, the introduction of a mobile transaction levy has seen the cost of transfers double. The Mobile Network Operators Association says the levy has already resulted in a 45% drop in revenues.
Tanzania is the second largest telecoms market in East Africa behind Kenya. The market here has grown from 12 million unique mobile phone subscribers in 2010 to over 25 million last year.
Despite numerous levies, mobile phone subscribers in the country enjoy the lowest internet costs in East Africa. However, Joyce feels things could still get better.
At least half of the present cost. It will make it easier for someone to afford because we can't expect the government to completely remove the levies.
The government says levies in the telecom sector are supposed to finance development in rural areas. It hopes Tanzanians will see things the same way and keep using their mobile phones. Isaac Lukando, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
USAID Chief Samantha Power has hailed Sudan's transition while on a visit to Khartoum. She met with some officials and discussed Sudan's urgent economic and humanitarian needs. The country has been going through a rocky transition since the ouster in April 2019 of President Omar al-Bashir.
Everyone in Sudan is grappling with inflation, higher prices. That is very difficult. And we, above all, as the United States, want to find a way to partner with you to reinvigorate the economy, to attract foreign investment to this country, to improve the investment climate so that big companies and banks and others want to come to Sudan, that they see that this is the new Sudan, that they can provide job opportunities to your young people who helped make this revolution and this transformation possible. The thorniest issues between the United States government and the Sudanese government have been addressed in recent months and in the last couple of years in a way that makes it possible to have engagements that involve two friends staring out at a problem together.
The Central Bank of Tunisia says the country needs to put in place international financial reporting standards to guide the operations of the financial sector. IFRS was created to improve transparency, accountability and efficiency of financial markets around the world. Here's Adnan Chouachi with the details from Tunis.
The Institute of Chartered Accountants of Tunisia said that the Tunisian financial sector's adoption of international financial reporting standards will help ensure good governance, competitive equity and transparency in the regulation of the banking market.
The adoption of the International Financial Reporting Standards is an important strategic reform for the economy in general and the financial sector in particular. These standards are a common international accounting language, allowing for uniform financial reporting that promotes comparability of performance and capital flow.
The president of the Tunisian Professional Association of Banks and Financial Institutions explained that there are many challenges facing the implementation of those international standards in the country.
The first problem is the readiness of Tunisian banks and financial institutions for the adoption of these international standards. Most banks do not have the required data and information to respect internationally recognized accounting standards. The second problem is the mentality of the clients, who may not be willing to provide personal information to the banks.
The head of the Union of Maghreb Banks says adopting international standards will allow Tunisian banks to mobilize external resources.
30% of the Tunisian banking sector is made up of banks with foreign capital. They are already implementing IFRS standards and did not wait for 2021. This is a good example for other Tunisian banks seeking external funding.
Experts say implementing the IFRS project needs to be monitored by the Central Bank of Tunisia as part of its strategic plan. The Central Bank of Tunisia said that the IFRS standardization system compels Tunisian authorities to be more demanding in terms of transparency and governance. The governor of the Apex Bank stressed the need to implement this single set of high-quality global standards. Adnan Chouachi, CGTN, Tunis.
Square, the payments firm of Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey, will purchase Afterpay Limited for $29 billion this Monday. The move with the buy now, pay later pioneer is expected to create a global transactions giant. It supports the popularity of a business model that has changed consumer credit by charging merchants a fee to offer small point-of-sale loans that shoppers repay in interest-free installments. The all-stock buyouts would value the shares at $92.65, according to a joint statement by the companies. Well, let's take a short break. Your sports news up next. Coming up, Kenya is expecting its first medals in the women's 5,000 meters and the men's 3,000 meter steeplechase.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.